Hola a todos, buenas tardes. Bienvenidos a otra charla con la Facultad de Economía y Negocios de la Universidad de Chile y MIT, de Sloan School y de Latin American Office. En unos segundos vamos a empezar. Hoy tenemos como invitado especial a Chad Bown. Un poco de paciencia mientras permitimos que todos se incorporen a la conversación. Quería mencionarles que hoy la charla va a ser en castellano. Quería mencionarles que la charla hoy va a ser en inglés con traducción simultánea. ¿Ok? En, en unos segundos empezaremos.
La traducción va a estar en el canal de YouTube de la facultad, así que ahí pueden mirarlo. It was a surprise when you said that would be in Spanish.
Buenas tardes a todos. Todavía tenemos gente que se está uniendo a la charla. Vamos a darle unos minutos más. Bienvenidos a otra de las charlas coorganizadas con la Universidad de Chile. En unos segundos vamos a comenzar. Hola, buenas tardes a todos. Bienvenidos a otra de las conversaciones coorganizadas con la Universidad de Chile y MIT. Hoy tenemos el gran placer de tener a Chad Bown como invitado especial. Quiero darle algunas reglas. Primero, la charla va a ser en inglés. Hay traducción simultánea tanto en Zoom como en el canal de YouTube de la Universidad de Chile. Por favor, vayan al canal de YouTube, también pueden ver la conferencia ahí que se va a estar transmitiendo. Una cosa importante, todas las preguntas y las pueden hacer tanto en el chat como en el Q&A. Nosotros preferimos que lo hagan en el Q&A y ustedes pueden votar en el de las preguntas cuáles son las que más les gustan. De ahora en adelante voy a switchar al inglés. So, thanks so much, everybody, for being here. It is a great pleasure to have Chad Bown as a special guest. In a second, Jose is going to do the introductions. I want to remind everybody about the rules. Please put all your questions either in the chat or on the Q&A. We prefer if you put the chats on the Q&A. It allows us to vote and determine which are the questions that are more relevant. Both Jose and I will be paying attention to both of them. Please, if you have problem with the translation, you can either see or hear the interpretation in the YouTube channel from the Universidad de Chile, for here. It's a great pleasure to organize another one of the seminars with the University of Chile. This is becoming a tradition. So thank you so much, Chad, and thank you so much, Jose, for all the efforts. And thanks to Jacqueline, Lee, and Tarek for all the support that we receive in these chats. Yeah, usually we get the credit, but we do not truly deserve it. So Jose, your role. Jose, you're muted.
It always happens. The computer tells me. So thank you very much, Roberto, and it is a pleasure to be with you and with Paris, Tarek, and Lee again in one of our quite interesting and timely webinars. This time we have Chad Jones. Chad Jones is Reginald Jones Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. His work is about international trade, laws, institutions, trade negotiations, trade disputes. He has been quite involved in the last few years on all the discussions about the trade war between China and US, having also a great side to follow the developments of this war. He also co-hosts Trade Talks at the Peterson website, a weekly podcast on the economics of international trade policy. It's also quite interesting for all people interested in international trade to follow what's going on in the world. He has worked at the Council of Economic Advisors in the White House, at the World Bank, and also was a visiting scholar at the World Trade Organization, so he's very well acquainted with all these issues, not just academic, but also from a policy point of view. He had a very successful career as professor of economics at Brandeis University before joining the Peterson. And of course, he had a large body of research published in top journals and has written also several books. So it is a pleasure to have with us a leading scholar in international trade, in which one of his latest contribution has been on the vaccine nationalism and the implication of all of this on trade and also on handling of the pandemic. So we already saw a little bit of this on the restrictions of trade on medical supplies, masks, ventilators, and all this stuff. So now, certainly this is a much more serious and important issue regarding a vaccine. So it is, it is an honor to have with us, Chad, and we're looking forward to your remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So let me share my screen and see if I can get the technology to work. Good. Hola, gracias. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I was telling Roberto before we got started that unfortunately my presentation is going to be in English. I grew up in a very small town in the United States. My mom speaks Spanish and she was the Spanish teacher in the small town in which I grew up in. And that's the reason why I don't speak any Spanish. I refused to take my mom as a teacher, so I took French. But I hope you'll bear with me. So what I thought I would do today is to talk about a couple of things. The first and most pressing, I guess, policy issue is this one of vaccine nationalism. We're all thinking about vaccines now as sort of the light that's keeping us all going through the pandemic. Just to warn you, I'm an economist, obviously. I'm a trade economist. I focus on trade policy, thinking about institutional design questions. I'm obviously not a medical doctor, not an epidemiologist. I'm like most of you, trying to learn what I can about this as we go along. But what I thought in my research has been very, very interesting is learning about what's unique about vaccines in terms of the economic features of the markets, but then also in terms of international trade and supply chains and how all of that might play into this question about how we are ultimately going to distribute a vaccine globally once the scientists have discovered one, right? And so we have a number of candidates that are out there now that are undergoing these what are called phase 3, various phases of trials. Some are as far as phase 3, the ones where they're distributing them to tens of thousands of people. Some people get placebos, other people get the treatment, and then we collect data and see how it works out. Now, there's one country in particular that I won't talk about today that has decided it doesn't need to have a phase 3 trial before it can start giving out its vaccine. to the public. We're not going to count that in this. There's good scientific reasons why that's not necessarily a good thing to do. So let me see if I can, yeah. So the piece I'm going to talk about is one that I wrote up with Tom Boyke at the Council of Foreign Relations, and it was just published in Foreign Affairs. Tom is a lawyer, legal scholar, and public health expert by training. So he's written books about pandemics. And so he's taught me much of kind of what I've needed to know throughout this process as well. He's not here on the webinar, but if you have really complicated questions about the science and the vaccines, you can ask me, and I will punt and save them for later to give them to Tom. And I'll be happy to follow up with you though. But he's really the sort of the medical expert for us on this project. And so the basic question about vaccines, vaccines are rife with issues of market failure. When we start to think about just the general issue of vaccines, and especially trying to distribute them globally. And so the main issue, of course, is we have vaccines that are traditionally given to children, right? Lots of diseases out there. We want to give vaccines to kids when they're very young so that they don't get exposed to certain diseases. And so we have great vaccination programs in rich countries. But for a very, very long time, it's been the case that these vaccines haven't been deployed quickly enough to children in poor countries. And, there's many reasons for that. And then also there are the questions of there are certain diseases that are only really endemic in certain populations around the world that are in poorer countries and for which vaccines haven't been developed. So there's lots of market failures that arise when you have these sorts of scenarios. One is when the big markets for these things are largely poor countries that aren't able to sort of generate the market demand that's necessary. Vaccines are also very, very different from other pharmaceutical products in that you typically only get it once, right? Or 1 or 2 doses. It's not like, blood pressure medication or some other sorts of chronic illnesses where pharmaceutical companies can kind of get their teeth into you and, you get hooked on some particular form of medication that you have to take time and time again, right? Vaccine, it's typically a one-off. You get it when you're a child and everybody's got to get it once, but it's not as huge a market as some of these other things. The science there, obviously, in order to come up with vaccines, as in much of the pharmaceutical industry, it requires big upfront costs, lots of R&D, very risky. You don't know if these things are going to work. But then once you actually have to manufacture them as well, it turns out that there's only a handful of countries in the world that actually have the capacity to manufacture vaccines. They're highly regulated, and for good reason. The facilities, the manufacturing facilities to produce vaccines are hundreds of millions of dollars to construct, billions of dollars to construct, require lots of capital equipment, but then all sorts of quality controls as well, just to kind of make sure that they're ultimately safe. And then, of course, there's the big question of, this isn't just a market with free, sort of entry and exit. You've got heavy-handed regulators to make sure, for good reason, that the vaccines that are being developed and allocated are safe for consumers. They undergo all these quality tests, and there is this ongoing back and forth between the public health and scientists. And so that's sort of the basics of vaccines. Now, how are things different with the pandemic? So there are some elements that are a little bit different. One is obviously the demand for this thing is huge. We don't need to worry about there being only niche pockets of demand for vaccines like you have for some diseases around the world, because everyone, it seems, is potentially subject to this. And so there's going to be massive demand, okay? But there is still the question of how to coordinate that demand. You're still going to have billions of people in poor countries that are going to need vaccines just as much as everybody else, but they don't have huge pocketbooks and whose public health systems don't have huge pocketbooks in order to be able to acquire these things. So on the demand side, and partially piggybacking off of earlier market failure recognition efforts to to address the child vaccine shortage and market failure issues. There's this international institution that's been developed called Gavi, and it's basically a partnership that was developed, in the mid to late 2000s by Bill Gates, Gordon Brown, the World Bank, Rockefeller Foundation were involved, recognizing there was this market failure and trying to fill in that gap. And so on the demand side this time around, what they have done is basically set up an advanced market commitment. So sort of recognizing one of the economic bottlenecks on the demand side in terms of financing. And so what they have done is to go out and say, okay, we recognize that there's going to be a lot of really, really poor countries out there that are going to need the vaccine once we have it. So we'll make sure to get their eligibility up and running. And so I think they have 92 or so developing countries that have gone through their vetting process for being eligible to receive the vaccine. And then they have 81 rich countries, or basically what they call self-financing countries, that have signaled interest, at least, in being part of their program. And the idea is the self-financing countries would contribute and not only procure their vaccines through this process, through this what's ultimately called the COVAX facility, but then also be contributing to the resources which would then help allocate the vaccines to the poorer countries as well. And so that's Gavi, that's the vaccine. The chair of the board of Gavi is Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who's former managing director of the World Bank, finance minister of Nigeria, one of the candidates currently in the running for the director general job of the World Trade Organization. And as Jose mentioned, I co-host a weekly podcast on trade called Trade Talks. And we just had the wonderful opportunity to interview her. The episode should be released today sometime about this crisis and about what the role of Gavi is and how to think about this. And so I would highly recommend you listening to that, because she'll be able to articulate other elements that better than I can. So that's the demand side. Obviously, there's going to be huge demand. And we know with this pandemic, it's happening everywhere. And so we basically need to get global coverage of vaccines. And we'll come back to this because this is going to be a hard question, even if we've got full cooperation. But we've got that. So that's that side. That's that piece of the puzzle. Then there's the supply side. So how do we get the vaccine to come forward? And obviously we've got lots of, you follow this in the news, you've got lots of folks around the world. There's now more than 165, I think is the latest number registered with the World Health Organization. Candidates that are in the pipeline, either in development, and I think there are 26 of them that have proceeded to the stage of in some phase of clinical trial, either the very beginning where they're just testing on a handful of people, or there's a couple that are, I think maybe 6 are in this phase 3 trial stage where they're now giving them to tens of thousands of people at a time to see if they work, if they don't work, how many dosages you need, are there side effects to these things? Are there certain populations that are benefiting better or worse, they don't work for, those kinds of things. So you have a lot of candidates out there. And luckily, there is a separate organization called CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations. They're sort of a non-profit, public-private organization that's based in, I think, Norway. And what they have done is to kind of coordinate the supply side. And so they have 9 vaccine candidates that are in their portfolio. And basically what they do is they go out to universities that are doing the research or the pharmaceutical companies, and they work with them. And they form a financial arrangement that basically says, we will chip in some of the costs that you need for promising candidates, for your R&D, for, the getting the initial doses produced for your clinical trials. Those very costly processes. And, if you're a university, you may not have these funds available. And in exchange for that, getting access to some of our funds, CEPI's funds, what you agree to do is to put yourself into the pool. And so if your vaccine turns out to be one of the ones that works, you put yourself into the pool that we can get access to for manufacturing down the line to be able to service the 100 and whatever, 70 something countries that might be part of the demand side of this exercise. So they're working on the supply side, and they have, as I said, 9 candidates in their portfolio. And obviously 9 is better than 1. You would hope they're not just going with 1, because any given one might not work. The ones they have include the Oxford AstraZeneca candidate, Moderna's candidate, Inovio's candidate, and a handful of others as well. So they're ones that they're not crazy ones, right? They're kind of frontline ones that look like they have a good chance of working. CEPI has also gone out and done a global survey, getting in touch with the pharmaceutical companies and the fill and finish manufacturers for vaccines, figuring out what vaccine capacity is going to look like over the next year. And based on their survey, they think there will be capacity to produce somewhere between 2 and 4 billion doses by the end of 2021. Now, that's good news and bad news. I mean, so there isn't more because, these pharmaceutical companies don't have lots of idle capacity sitting around, right? We can't just stop making all of the other vaccines that we need to inoculate, children and people against all the other various diseases that are out there. Those other diseases aren't going away. So they've had to ramp up manufacturing capacity, and this is what they've come up with. And so the idea with this program, so the COVAX facility is put together by these 3 organizations: Gavi on the demand side, CEPI on the supply side, and the World Health Organization on the sort of regulatory, policy, scientific side. And you put all these things together, and they're hoping to have enough dosages to be able to give all of the countries that would sign up to this program, some that would be self-financing, some rich countries that would pay in, but then the 90 plus poorer countries that would be just beneficiaries of this, enough to cover about 20% or so of their populations next year. And so obviously that's not everybody, but then they need to figure out what the allocation scheme would be within countries, and that you would do this based on science, trying to go after, healthcare workers that are at the front line of keeping everybody else safe, giving them the vaccines first. The most, elderly, immunocompromised populations, this kind of thing. So, you use science to figure out who, if you're going to only immunize or inoculate 20% of your population, who that 20% would be. Okay, so this sounds like a great plan, right? This sounds like economists have helped solve, these market failures and come up with a solution that could potentially work, right? It's not perfect. We can't get, 8 billion. We're probably going to need maybe even 16 billion doses because, you might need multiple doses, to get everybody covered. So we're not all the way there, but we're at a start. So what's wrong with this? Well, so countries have until the end of August to sign up to this program. And so we're still only in the middle of August, so it's still not too late. If any government officials are on the webinar, I can give you the 1-800 number that you can call in to sign up. It's not too late. But as of yet, we have a number of major supplying countries that haven't signed on to the agreement, that haven't signed up for this program. And this would include the United States, China, France, Germany, and a number of others. And why these are key, it's not just because, the US and the European countries are rich and they can afford to pay in, but this is also where a lot of the manufacturing capacity is located. And so the concern is that while you have these companies that have signed up to be part of the CEPI program, offering their candidate to be part of the program, if the manufacturing facility where they might produce that vaccine is located in a country that's not interested in sharing with the world, they may not be able to ultimately fulfill the deal, right? And so you can imagine, I live in a country right now, I'm in Washington, D.C. It's hot, it's humid, it's raining, and just down the street, we have a president that is not really interested in sharing in global cooperation and has made no overtures about being a part of this program. And in fact, has gone out and signed contracts with a number of different pharmaceutical companies, taking for billions of dollars, saying we're going to buy hundreds of millions of doses of your vaccine, basically, taking a lot of that stuff potentially off the market, not sharing it. And so this is the concern, is that while the program might be well thought out and well established, if you don't get the governments to actually buy into this program, it could unravel. And so we still have time, but some of the major players haven't bought into it yet. And as was mentioned earlier, we've already seen during this crisis examples of policies being deployed that would stop the export of these types of vaccines. I didn't mention this, but let me pause to say, unfortunately, with vaccine manufacturing, compulsory licensing is unlikely to work as a global solution. So we do have rules in the international trading system under the WTO, under the TRIPS agreement, the Intellectual Property Rights Protection Agreement, that says that, if you're not willing to supply, medicines to poor countries at reasonable prices, governments of those countries can engage in what's called compulsory licensing. Sort of break your patent, give you a reasonable fee, but allow somebody locally to be able to produce the medicine. With vaccines, that's really unlikely to be a solution. It's just too complicated, too tricky for most poorer countries to be able to produce with the quality regulations in place and the high fixed cost of doing so for that to solve the problem. So they are going to be very, very reliant on trade. And that means we need these vaccines to be manufactured, produced in places that are going to be willing to export it. And if we've got this vaccine nationalism and hoarding going on, that's the spanner in the works. So we saw examples of that with PPE and ventilators, as mentioned back in March and April. But even in earlier pandemics, epidemics, we have seen governments engage in this kind of thing. So as I was researching this, I found that back in 1976, we had an outbreak of swine flu in the United States that looked like for a while that it was going to be very bad. The Canadians contracted with American vaccine manufacturers to procure it. And then when it came time to deliver, the US administration at the time said, no, you're not going to be able to export this stuff. We're going to keep it here. So luckily it didn't turn into as bad a pandemic as it could have. And so it didn't turn out to be a big deal. But it could have been. And we saw the similar thing happen in 2009 with the H1N1 pandemic. There, a number of rich countries had promised developing countries that they would get access to their vaccines, but then failed to deliver. Now, and the thing I'll conclude on here is why this could get ugly. In the current world in which we live with global supply chains, it's still impossible at this moment to know. We don't know yet the science of which one of these, or if there are going to be multiple ones that are going to work, which ones will work. And thus we don't know all of the ingredients that they're going to need. And so as I was learning about this, I've learned that one of the most important ingredients for a number of vaccines that are already out there, not necessarily for the coronavirus, but for other things, is what's called an adjuvant. And one of the key adjuvants, these are kind of supercharger, power boosters that they put to make vaccines work with your immune system. One of the most important adjuvants is, I'm sure this is front page news in Chile every day, comes from the soap bark tree, which is pretty much only found in Chile. And so what that means is if that ingredient is needed to be able to manufacture vaccines in the United States or in Europe or elsewhere around the world, Chile has some power. It can say, well, you're not going to get the input unless you send me some of the output, right? So we'll see. That's, it's good power to have. And in my mind, that's how you can enforce if what's preventing countries at the moment from signing up to this agreement is the concern that the agreement would be unenforceable. That even if you could somehow convince President Donald Trump to sign up to a sharing agreement where the Americans agree to get some access to, a European based vaccine in exchange for sharing with the world any American based vaccine that would come there first. They're worried that the Americans might renege on that deal. Well, one way you can kind of enforce that and not allow the reneging to happen is if you can threaten to take something away that's of value, and one would be key inputs. Now, we aren't sure what all those key inputs are going to be, but we know that supply chains are complicated. It's pretty unlikely that the United States, even the United States, will be able to think through all of the inputs in sufficient quantity ahead of time to be able to make sure that it's going to be able to sufficiently roll out all the manufacturing that it needs. So I think there's good arguments to cooperate. It's one of the most challenging institutional design questions that I've kind of ever had to think about in my professional career. but I think it's possible. And of course, you know, for lots and lots of economic as well as humanitarian reasons, obviously, it's the right thing to do. So I think with that, I'll stop on that, and I'm happy to kind of take questions, or if nobody's interested in vaccines, we can obviously talk about the trade war too, but the trade war seems like it'll go on forever. So.
No, I think we will be very, no, I think this is thank you so much. This is fantastically good. So some people are asking about the name of the tree. Jose, what is the name of the tree? Do you know it?
Quillay. Quillay.
Quillay, okay.
Illay. Is when I read the chat's paper, I had to say, well, what is so by tree? And I found that's cool. We call it quillay.
Yeah. But don't go and cut them down. We might need them. If you have one in your backyard or something right now, put a fence around it to make sure you keep it safe, because we might need it.
Yes.
So well, there is the natural question. The first question, I think that the people is quite interested, and is what may also looking for is what do you think about would be a position of the U.S. government towards COVAX if eventually there is a presidential change after the November elections? That's it.
So, you know, I want to say that if it were a different president right now, that the United States position on this issue would be very, very different. But I think also that would be a little bit naive, because even, you know, when I was talking about the H1N1 pandemic in 2009, you know, that was the Obama administration. It was early days of the Obama administration, but, you know, they kind of didn't behave as one in a fully globally cooperative way that one would hope. So I think we do have to recognize that all countries and have political leaders that face voters. So we'll see. And I think that the bigger concern is we are getting close to knowing scientifically, hopefully, and this is a good thing, that one of these things is going to work. And once we know who's first and which ones are going to work, it's much more difficult to get the cooperative agreement, because part of the benefits of the cooperative agreement are kind of risk sharing, right? It's hedging against the fact that mine might not work.
Yeah.
And so I think as time passes, it makes it more and more difficult. And by November or January, when a Biden team would show up, you know, I'm hoping. But that being said, this is how we have to do this going forward. So we need to be thinking about mapping this kind of stuff out, because this is probably not the last time this type of an issue is going to confront us, unfortunately.
I was very, so from the list of the 4 big countries that you had there, I was not surprised that US and China have not signed, but I was depressingly surprised that France and Germany has not signed. Can you comment a little bit on that? I mean, it's very disappointing. I mean, I understand China and United States. By the way, has Russia signed? So this will make this even more depressing.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if Russia has signed or not.
Okay.
It's on their website. You can list. And there are countries, they have until the end of August. There are countries that have signaled interest but not publicly revealed that they're signaling interest yet. So there may be some game theoretic arguments and things going on here. Now, France and Germany and the Europeans are a little bit tricky. So early on in this process, the Europeans were actually very supportive of it, trying to get it off the ground. The European Union, it was. But there's kind of reports that the European Union may be sort of losing support. There are smaller coalitions of countries within Europe that seem to be working with each other on these issues. And so maybe that's part of what you're going to end up seeing is kind of coalitions of countries. But obviously when we need a global approach, that's not going to do it.
I see.
The other, just one other minor thing though is, unfortunately, and I'm a big fan of the European project as well. In the early days of the crisis, Germany and France were some of the earliest countries to impose export restrictions on personal protective equipment. Yeah. And they did it toward other EU member states.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just that they were doing it to the rest of the world. they refused to sell respirators and gowns and masks to Italy.
Italy, yeah.
During the height of the crisis. So everybody's got a little, whatever the expression is, egg on their face at this stage.
On the other hand, that would, if that were to happen again, I think it's the demise of the European Union.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm also a trade economist, so I cannot imagine that happening again.
Well, there is this question, which it immediately when you put the numbers, I was very worried, and also some people has been asking. You said that by the end of next year, we would have 2 to 4 billion vaccines administered, let's think. And in the world, we need 10 billion. I don't know, because you said, well, it could be two times for somebody, or just let's say 6, 7 billion. This means that the economy, just the global economy, will be at the 90% with some partial lockdowns for the next couple of years easily. So I think that this is, despite the market optimism, for example, that the vaccine will be next year administered to some part in the US, some part here and there, but we will live with this virus, unless it changes, but we will not be able to control it for the next couple of years, which has, of course, a lot of implications for national and the global economy, I think.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, so there is a fair amount of uncertainty still, even with these estimates, because they went out and there's different kinds of vaccines. So some of the ones that are being developed in China are kind of the older way of making vaccines. Some of the new ones that are being developed in the United States and Europe are these mRNA varieties, and there's just different manufacturing facilities have different capabilities of being able to produce. So it depends on which ones ultimately work will also influence how much you're going to be able to get. And so this is just to say, there's still tremendous uncertainty, and they've recognized that when they did this survey. But what they wanted to do was to try to get a lay of the land to figure out at least, what are we talking about in terms of the ballpark here, and where is it located?
Let me add a little bit to that question, Chad. If you had to guess a little bit of the timing, so I mean, you told us that at Cap T, end of last year, that we might have 2 to 4 billion. So if everything goes, I think that's an optimistic estimate with what you're saying. No? So that's on the optimistic side. So what would be kind of the timing? So we will have, by the fourth quarter of this year, we will have some news that we have a couple that are working, and then the ramp up. So how do we get to that 4 billion? Because I imagine that this is not going to be that easy to produce at the beginning. So actually producing like 5,000 a day at the beginning will be really hard, and then we will get better as time goes. So we have to be very clear about how we distribute that. So can you comment a little bit on the timing, and then how will you organize the ramp up and the provision of the vaccines, or the allocation of the vaccines?
So again, I'm not a medical doctor or scientific expert or a clinician, but what has also been told to me in this process is, the way the phase 3 trials work is they try to go out and they collect enough data to be able to administer the vaccines effectively, right? To try to figure out who the right populations should be as targets. But that being said, they don't collect all the data that they need at that stage. So there's still just, even at that stage, a lot of data collection that's going on, or should hopefully continue to be going on, even after you start administering these vaccines. So yes, on the production side, there's going to be, presumably learning by doing and that kind of things. You'll get better and more efficient at it as you go along. But also on the distribution side, I think you're going to learn some things after it is administered to bigger populations of people about what the allocation process should be as well. So it is going to be, ideally, I think, this kind of updating that takes place. Now, but I think to your broader question, even at the best case scenario, if you've got 4 billion doses by the end of 2020, how many do you have by the end of January, by the end of the first quarter, by the end of that? I don't know. And I didn't, I don't know that necessarily their survey is detailed enough to be able to spell that out. And I think I think there's still a lot of uncertainty, but I think your point is well taken. This doesn't mean 4 billion doses on January 1st of 2021. If anything, it's probably not 4 billion doses until December 31st, the very end of the year, right? If anything.
Yeah. One of the comments that we received in the Q&A said that this could be also like influenza, that you need a shot every year.
Yeah. No, that's exactly right.
They say 10 billion a year is a huge thing, and yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
That is interesting. So for the pharmaceutical companies, if this is one shot a year, it might be easier for them to ramp up production because you can justify it, no?
Yeah, right.
I think that's right. Yeah, and we'll see. I mean, there's going to be, lots of interesting questions about licensing. And while compulsory licensing won't work for every country, there are going to be interesting licensing arrangements set up. You probably will have new countries, come on the scene as being able to manufacture. It's amazing to think that if you're a pharmaceutical company and you want to have flexibility about where you're able to sell some of these vaccines once you manufacture them, that right now you're thinking to yourself, I don't want to set up a new manufacturing plant in the United States. So that's not going to give me any flexibility at all because Donald Trump is just going to hoard it all, right? Yeah. So I want to set up this manufacturing facility in a high regulatory state country that's got good regulations and will trust the science, but actually has a very, very small population. So I can just distribute to them, but then I can export globally, however it is that I want to do it, whether I'm interested in, public health and ethical issues, or if I'm just seeking to make a lot of money kind of thing, right? These are really interesting economic market questions that
Chad, you just described
political economy are fascinating.
Yeah. Chad, you just described Uruguay, Colombia, and Chile.
So now's your moment.
If you want it smaller, Costa Rica is available.
But this is it, right? Now is the moment, given the political economy of how the world has changed over the last couple of years.
So,
well, AstraZeneca just announced that they will produce the vaccines in Mexico and Argentina. That's what is in the news now.
Yeah. So that's great. The other interesting things though and I don't know enough about this, is where they're going to do this, right? And so some of these places, they have existing facilities themselves to be able to do vaccines. Some of it is they're kind of subcontracting out with partners, these kind of fill and finish facilities. But we'll see. This could be, revolutionary for the pharmaceutical industry in and of itself. Maybe there will be new models of collaborative behavior that emerge through all of this.
So one question that I saw here that I thought it was an important one. So in the collection of the data for phase 3, how do we know when the vaccine could be harmful for the population? So in the previous experiences, do you know?
So I don't, except that I know that there are some trials that are cut off early. And so, they're collecting data as they go along. And if, they start to see patterns in the data that are very, very worrisome, they're not going to continue to inflect it on future recipients, even within that population. So I don't know, except that, the longer the time, I guess what I would say, the longer the time passes and that hasn't happened,
it's better.
That's good news.
Yeah. That's good news. Yeah. My wife is watching your talks, and so she sent me this morning one tweet about the vaccine from Russia, and I have many questions about the vaccine of Russia. So first,
there is a dialogue, yeah.
Yes. So first, it is not injecting yourself vodka, no? Just to be sure that
I don't know.
No. So do we know anything about this vaccine that Russia is promoting?
Not really. Not really. Obviously Russia has brilliant scientists. And so I think we can't dismiss the idea that this vaccine could ultimately work and could ultimately be valuable. I think the concern of not going through the process is the way I think about it is maybe twofold or maybe threefold even. So first is, suppose it doesn't work and they give it to the Russian population. Obviously it's got, not only does it not work, it's got side effects. And some of these vaccines, some vaccines historically have had side effects, or at least they're thinking that they did, the ones that didn't work. And that's why they pull them out and they don't give them it. So if that happens, that's going to make it even more difficult down the line to convince your public that if you do have a vaccine that works, they should take it. They should trust it, right? So I think that's one problem. But there's even a problem of, suppose it does work. That puts pressure on all of the other vaccine candidates around the world to short circuit the normal, phase 3 trial process for their vaccines as well. And we know from experience that most of the time vaccines don't work, right? That's why we have these trials. And so if all of a sudden you put politics into this, right, that's gonna make it more and more difficult. I think for the vaccine nationalism kind of concern and the concern of developing countries, if the rich countries where the vaccines are more likely to be developed and manufacturers are going to hoard them for themselves. So if the United States, Europe aren't going to share vaccines that are more likely to work with poorer countries, those countries are going to be desperate. Yeah. They're going to be more likely to say, we'll try that Russian vodka vaccine because we need to try something, right? And so that's why I think it's actually very, very worrisome. The announcement sort of without going through the general vetting, rigorous scientific process to ensure its efficacy and its safety.
Well, isn't that after phase 2, vaccines that arrive to phase 3, just 10% or 20% of them end up being successful? So it's quite it's quite a risky move.
It's tiny, and we as economists, it's a big N problem, right? You don't, until you roll this stuff out into thousands of people, you don't get enough variation in the data to be able to identify kind of what works and what doesn't, and where the side effects come in and that kind of thing. So I think that's why at least I, as an economist, I'm very sympathetic to them wanting to collect as much data as possible. As I looked at this, I said, why is 30,000 people in a phase 3 trial enough, right? How'd you come up with 30,000? And I have a friend who's a health economist and a Bayesian, and he's sort of the agreement that 30,000 is, there's a lot of learning that happens after that. Let's put it like that.
Yeah. So as we go through these, there will be a lot of herd immunity that we'll be capturing at the same time. So the young might get infected, and we know from the studies in Europe that probably the infected is about 10 times the population. So truly already in the US, in the world, we have about 200 million, according to that estimate. So how do you see this playing out? Because the trade restrictions will force countries into herd immunity anyway. And by the way, we don't even know if herd immunity can happen.
Yeah.
So, but it's kind of putting some countries in that corner, isn't it?
Well, I think that's the big concern, is that, or at least the big concern for me, is we don't know on the science of if herd immunity is even feasible with this, or if, sort of as you indicated before, that it's now one of these diseases that mutates, and we're going to need vaccines for this kind of thing every year, or every kind of new season of this. Until we know otherwise, I think we have to assume that that's the new normal, and that's how we have to adjust our thinking on this in terms of public health. I think I didn't really go into this in the talk, but I think there's obviously huge economic arguments for why it's in nobody's best interest to hoard, these vaccines for themselves. Right? I talked about the supply chains, and you may lose access to the ability to make the vaccine. But even as we've seen during the pandemic, in the United States where I sit, we've had examples of supply chain disruptions, the automobile sector, for example, because they can't get parts from Mexico. So if Mexico can't have its industry up and running to make the engines or, the seat belts or whatever for automobiles, the final car can't be assembled. And if we can't make cars, then, we can't export cars. If we can't make airplanes, we can't export airplanes. If the rest of the world isn't driving and flying, then, they're not going to be growing. They're not going to be buying our stuff either. So, there's lots and lots of economic reasons why it's a global problem that needs to be tackled. And I think we really need to start thinking about it that way. And policymakers aren't yet, and maybe it's because they're fearful of voters. But I think we as kind of citizens need to educate ourselves on a lot of these issues as well.
Yeah, this makes even more surprising why France and Germany have not signed on the Gavi. The Gavi is just stating formally what you're just saying, that it is better for Germany and France to have a healthy, emerging markets. So.
Yeah, I don't have good explanations. I can make up some based on, how I can imagine policymakers feel given how they've been treated by the Trump administration for the last 3 years. And this is my dog making noise here in the room next to me. So if you're Angela Merkel or Emmanuel Macron, say, and you sign up to this agreement and you agree to share, and you get there first, but you have to share with the United States, fine, you're willing to live up to it. But suppose, the United States gets there first. There's a really good chance Donald Trump doesn't share, right? And that's a really big political problem that you're going to have to face. You've already been whacked with tariffs and threats of tariffs continually over the last 3 years. You've got the administration pulling out of the climate accord. You've got, moving out of the Iran agreement. So, how many more times do you want to expose yourself to a political backlash coming out of this U.S. administration? So, in some sense, unfortunately, I'm empathetic to political leaders in other countries not reaching out and exposing themselves politically, given, sort of how they've been treated over the last couple of years.
And I think that what's happened with this, the countries that are out of the agreement, they are the most likely to get to produce a vaccine. So they want to keep discretion. So the other thing is that, let's say they want to keep it just for themselves. We understand that that's bad even for them. But at least they may want to wait a while in order to have some degree of discretion and negotiation, because at the end, the issues, it is interesting exactly what you're saying. At the end, you want to save your people, and they may have that first priority, but in order to save their people, they also need to save the world because of the interrelationships among countries in trade and in everything. So we really need there is in their self-interest to also protect the rest of the world.
Yeah, my guess is what will happen is once you see countries, once the discoveries happen and they start manufacturing and they figure out if they've been able to vaccinate their own populations, how much they have left over, then the largesse will come in and they'll start being willing to share. But then there's going to be strings attached. We're going to want you to do X, Y, or Z for us, and this is who we're going to share with, but not them. And so there you get, geopolitics and kind of stuff coming in.
But what you're saying is that there is a very big relationship, and globalization is quite important. So we really need the world working everywhere. So this I would go, and I think that this is a good point to ask you, how this globalization and trade around the world has worked during the pandemic. So before we have a vaccine, it is too friction trade because of countries with a high degrees of cases, or has trade been able to move? So I think that this is also help us to understand what will happen with vaccines, but also what's going on with trade.
Yeah. So it's very interesting how, the shocks played out, right? Back in January, we thought that this might just be kind of a supply side shock coming out of China, right? Wuhan, there was a lot of really important economic activity coming out of there. It's sort of the central hub of their automotive sector in China. They do a lot of electronics there. And there was pharmaceutical stuff that, you know, when they had to kind of shut down, there was the risk and concern that active pharmaceutical ingredients weren't then being shipped to India. It was slowing down their pharmaceutical supply chains. So the initial concerns was just, you know, this could be a supply side shock, say like Fukushima was, right, back in 2011. But then obviously when the pandemic spread globally, it became a much bigger deal, because then you've got the supply shocks happening everywhere coupled with demand shocks. And that's made it, I think, complicated to diagnose what's been driving the kind of quirky elements of what's been happening with trade flows. But obviously trade is dropped significantly. Now, obviously some of that is demand, some of that is frictions. You know, there have been, you know, I guess as a policy person, the question that I'm confronted with the most at the moment is this seemingly nebulous question of, you know, the resilience of supply chains in the face of a pandemic. And the idea that, well, we need to reshore certain things here in the United States to where I am because, you know, we're not resilient enough or something, right? So there's all this very loose conversation. And so my first reaction to that is, well, you know, domestically supply chains have been pretty disrupted as well for reasons that have nothing to do with trade. Yeah. Right. And so, you know, we can't get the comfortable toilet paper anymore because there's a massive demand increase, and there's been a massive demand decrease for the commercial grade toilet paper, right? And so, but we buy most of our toilet paper from locally in the United States. We've had meat packing facilities have to shut down. And so we've had disruptions to the food supply, nothing to do with trade, but that was because we had workers that were exposed to the coronavirus that couldn't go in, you know, to the job. And there, the argument I would make is, well, in some of those situations, we're lucky to be exposed to international trade so that we're not only reliant on ourselves and our domestic supply chains for some of these things. So this is a huge question that policymakers are confronting with now. And obviously in the case of the United States, most of this is being caught up in the trade war. The fact that early on in the pandemic, it became apparent to the world that the United States and the world was, reliance not the right word, but China is a massive supplier of personal protective equipment globally. We don't have good domestic production data to be able to say with any certainty, you know, this is how reliant we are on China for our total consumption. But we do have good trade data, and the trade data says that, you know, more than 50% of a lot of these products are coming out of, the exports at least are coming out of China. And I think what we've learned is it's hard to both be heavily reliant on one country and to be fighting a trade war with that country where you're telling them both, we desperately need your stuff because we're having a pandemic, and yet we also don't want your stuff, so we're going to put tariffs on it at the same time. That's sort of a hard strategy to wrap your head around. So this is where the United States is with this question, right? But that's where we are, right? The idea now, and we're seeing crazy, you know, I'm sure you've seen the reports too, that, you know, because so much of our pharmaceutical industry is involved in trade, we're now giving money to Kodak so that they can make pharmaceutical products. But this is what's happening in the United States at the moment. I think it's this, there's a lot of research and diagnostics that have to take place. And unfortunately, it's all being based on very, very little data, just because we lack access to really good data on domestic production. We've got good data on trade, but that makes us look more exposed to international markets than I think we actually are, just because we have very, very bad domestic supply chain data on a lot of these critical industries.
Let me finish with one question that I saw here that is kind of a scary question, but imagine that this is not the last pandemic we're going to see, of not necessarily of this magnitude, but other type of pandemic. So instead of, you know, thinking about how we're going to deal with the next one, what would be the international institutions you would like to strengthen? So next time we have a little bit better collaboration, better preparation, better resilience to the next one that is very likely to appear.
Yeah. So I will say, I'm amazed that this group CEPI, Gavi, and the WHO have put together in short order a program that, like, if countries were willing to cooperate, it looks like it would work. I guess the issue is that suppose you have a rogue player out there. I mean, just even in general time inconsistency concerns, right? It doesn't have to be a rogue player, even just a self-interested player. You're worried about enforcement. Is whoever does get there first, you're worrying about them reneging on the deal. So you've got to build some sort of rapid enforcement mechanism into this, that they don't renege. I think the supply chain story is the way to enforce that. And so maybe you need sort of an expedited role for the WTO there to be able to play into this somehow. Certainly saying, well, if you imposed an export restriction, we would file a WTO dispute against you. And, 5 years later, we would have a ruling that somebody could authorize. No, right? During a pandemic, that doesn't move quickly enough. Yeah. But during the pandemic, some of the bad policies that governments implemented were either reversed or modified very, very quickly once they realized how exposed to supply chains and potential retaliation they were. And so, for example, the United States, when the Trump administration invoked the Defense Production Act and was threatening to not sell respirators and gloves from 3M, produced in, I think, South Dakota and Nebraska, to Canada and Mexico, and a lot of other countries in Latin America. This is where, 3M produces these things at those plants there, and they sell to the entire hemisphere. The Trump administration said, no, we don't want you to sell to anybody outside of, just only Americans. Canadians, they didn't have to really make loud noises, but they could have made noises to say things like, in order to make hospital gowns and respirators and surgical masks, you need hospital grade pulp. You get that from our facilities in British Columbia, and we could shut those off. And you wouldn't have the pulp. There's no respirators, and so voila. And similarly, Justin Trudeau, I think, said, there's a lot of Canadian doctors and nurses that every day go into Detroit to help treat American patients that are suffering during the pandemic. Shut the borders. Maybe they won't be able to. In any case, supply chains can be used, I think, to help enforce, to make sure that the countries actually live up to the deal. And what happened in that instance is the Trump administration backed off, and the export restrictions that they imposed weren't nearly as draconian as the first ones they rolled out. And there's a similar story that I think came out of Europe as well. Their initial export restrictions initially hit Norway, Switzerland, and once they realized, there's some countries that are involved in these supply chains that aren't part of the EU, they made them much less restrictive as well. So I'm hopeful. You'd like for them to not have to go through those lessons and recognize it ex ante, but I'm hopeful that rational governments at least could recognize this.
Perfect.
Great. It's been quite an illuminating conversation, and your presentation was great. I think we have learned a lot, and this, I think that this is quite fascinating, this link between trade, global war, vaccines, and pandemic, and a pandemic that also has been so widespread because we live in a small global world. Yeah. And I think that so learning and hearing from you has been great. Thank you very much. Chat has been a wonderful talk and conversation. I'm certain that
we know you're incredibly busy, so thank you so much for this time. This is, by the reactions that you see on the chats and on the Q&A, you see that people in Latin America are incredibly concerned about this. So thank you so much for that. We hope that your best scenario is the one that actually occurs, and that we can actually get past this pandemic.
I'm an optimist at heart, so we'll keep fighting for it regardless of who the policymakers are in office. We'll figure out some way to be able to make it work.
Yeah, and thanks for that work, actually.
Yeah.
Actually, thank you for all that. Thank you for everybody.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Chad and Tarek, Lee, Jacqueline, and everybody.
Thank you to everybody. La grabación va a estar disponible para todos en la página web, así que busquen los links ahí. Thank you, Chad, and thank you to everybody. Thank you.
Gracias.